Rain hammered corrugated tin overhead, echoing through an absolutely silent salvage yard. 4 hardened enforcers held their breath, waiting for Roman Caldwell to draw a weapon. Nobody tells Chicago's most dangerous syndicate boss no, especially not some stubborn mechanic drowning in crushing inherited debt. But when Maeve slid his diamond ring back across a rusted iron workbench, Roman didn't reach for any gun. What he did instead left every single enforcer in that room utterly paralyzed with fear. The scent of ozone and decaying timber hung heavy in the cavernous space of iron and oak salvage. Maeve wiped a streak of soot from her forehead, leaving a dark smudge across her pale skin, and flipped her welding mask back down. Sparks showered the concrete floor, briefly illuminating the chaotic graveyard of Chicago's forgotten architecture. Gargoyles with chipped wings, massive oak doors stripped from demolished cathedrals, and wrought-iron gates piled high like the bones of dead giants. It was freezing. The industrial heater in the corner had died 3 days ago, right around the time the final notice from the bank arrived. Maeve's knuckles ached. The cold lived in her joints now. She killed the torch, plunging the corner of the shop back into the gloom of a Tuesday afternoon, and pulled off her heavy leather gloves. Then came the sound, the low, synchronized crunch of tires on the gravel driveway outside. Not the rattling diesel of a delivery truck, or the hesitant crawl of a hipster looking for a vintage doorknob. This was the heavy, predatory purr of high-end engines. Maeve didn't run to the window. She just leaned against the cold steel of the workbench and closed her eyes. She knew exactly who it was. The debt was a living, breathing thing that sat in the passenger seat of her life left behind by a father who loved the roulette wheel more than he loved oxygen. $300,000, borrowed from the kind of people who didn't send strongly worded letters. They sent men like Roman Caldwell. The rolling aluminum garage door rattled, then shrieked upward. The bleak grey light of the November afternoon spilled into the shop, closely followed by the silhouettes of 4 men. 3 of them walked like bouncers, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the shadows of the salvage yard for threats that didn't exist. Garrett, tall and wide, led the vanguard. Boyd and Declan flanked the rear, but the man in the center moved differently. He didn't swagger. He just occupied space as if he owned the air around him. Roman Caldwell stepped into the dust. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than Maeve's entire inventory. The fabric absorbed the dim light. His shoes were polished leather, completely out of place against the grease-stained concrete. He stopped a few feet from her workbench, his dark, calculating eyes drifting over the rusted corbels and the half-restored stained glass window she had been working on. "You're open late," Roman said. His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges, lacking the polished cadence of the corporate criminals downtown. He was a street kid who had clawed his way to the top of a blood-soaked empire, and he sounded like it. "I live here," Maeve replied flatly. She didn't cross her arms. She didn't shrink. She just stood her ground, resting a hip against the metal table. "Makes the commute easy." Roman's gaze shifted to her. He didn't look at her like a thug sizing up a victim. He looked at her the way an appraiser looks at a piece of contested real estate. It made her skin crawl. He had been coming around for 3 weeks, always buying something useless. A bronze lamp base, a rusted weather vane, paying in crisp hundreds and leaving without asking for a receipt. She knew he wasn't decorating a townhouse. He was observing her. "Your father owed my family $300,000, Roman said, skipping the preamble. "With the VIG, it's north of 4. My father is dead, Roman." "Debts don't die, Maeve. They just inherit new addresses." Garrett shifted his weight in the background, his hand casually resting near the bulge beneath his leather jacket. Maeve noticed the movement, but kept her eyes locked on Roman. "I don't have it," she said. The truth was bitter metallic in her mouth. You can take the inventory. The building is mortgaged to the hilt, but you can have the lease. Take the trucks. It won't clear 400, but it's all there is. Roman stepped closer. He reached out and ran a gloved finger along the edge of the iron table, examining the dust he picked up. I don't want rusted iron. I don't want broken glass. Then you're going to have to kill me, she said, her voice devoid of theatrics. It was just a statement of fact. Because unless you know how to extract cash from my bone marrow, I'm tapped. Roman's jaw tightened. A muscle ticked beneath his sharp cheekbone. He took off his leather gloves, slowly, deliberately, finger by finger, and tucked them into his coat pocket. He reached into his inner breast pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He tossed it onto the table. It landed with a heavy, dead sound. That's the marker, Roman said. Your father's signature, the ledger entries, the deed to this property which my associates bought from your bank this morning. Maeve stared at the envelope. Her heart gave a heavy, painful thud against her ribs. They owned the banknote. They owned her. What do you want? She asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Roman looked at her, his expression entirely unreadable. A wife. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was suffocating. Even the wind howling through the gaps in the tin roof seemed to pause. Maeve stared at Roman, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the cruel, mocking laugh that usually accompanied the extortion tactics of the men in his syndicate. But Roman's face was carved from granite. Behind him, Garrett and Declan exchanged a sharp, confused look. They hadn't known about this part of the plan. Excuse me. Maeve finally managed the words, scraping out of her dry throat. I need a wife. Roman repeated his tone, as casual as if he were ordering a coffee. My operations are expanding. The feds are looking for weaknesses. The old families, the ones I do business with, they don't trust a bachelor. It looks unstable. It looks like I have nothing to lose. So hire a bloody escort, Maeve shot back, the initial shock curdling into a hot, bright anger. Buy a socialite. You have the money. Why come to a junkyard to shop for a bride? Roman took another step forward, invading her personal space. He smelled of cold air, expensive cologne, and something distinctly metallic. I don't want a socialite who will spend my money and run her mouth to her country club friends. I don't want a woman terrified of her own shadow, and I don't want someone who faints at the sight of blood. I watched you throw out 2 crankheads trying to steal your copper wire last week. You didn't call the cops. You handled it. He gestured to the envelope on the table. You marry me. We sign a prenuptial agreement. You play the role at public events, dinners, sit-downs. You stay loyal. In exchange, the debt vanishes. This shop becomes yours, free and clear. You'll never have to look over your shoulder. You'll never freeze in the winter. And you'll never worry about a bank threatening to take your life's work again. He reached into his pocket again. This time, he pulled out a small black velvet box. He flipped it open. A diamond the size of a hazelnut caught the meager light of the shop, fracturing it into sharp, icy prisms. It was blinding. It was offensive. Garrett cleared his throat, a low sound of warning. Boss, you sure about this? She's just Shut your mouth, Garrett! Roman snapped, not looking away from Maeve. The command cracked like a whip. Garrett instantly fell silent, his posture stiffening. Roman pushed the velvet box across the rusted iron table until it stopped inches from Maeve's resting hand. It's a clean transaction, Roman said, his voice dropping, taking on a softer, almost persuasive cadence. You want survival. I want stability. You put that ring on, you walk out of here with me, and your life changes today. Maeve looked down at the ring. It represented an end to the crushing anxiety that kept her awake at 3 a.m. It represented heat food security, All she had to do was sell herself to a monster. She looked at the 3 armed men standing behind him. This wasn't a proposal. It was an ambush. He had brought an audience to ensure her compliance. He expected her to crumble to weep with gratitude that the great Roman Caldwell had found a use for her beyond a shallow grave. She looked back up at Roman. His eyes were dark, expectant. He thought he knew exactly how the world worked. Money buys fear. Fear buys obedience. Maeve let out a harsh, cynical laugh. It echoed off the high ceiling, startling the pigeons nesting in the rafters. She picked up the velvet box. Roman's shoulders relaxed slightly, a microscopic tell of his victory. Maeve snapped the box shut. The sharp clack echoed loudly. She pushed it back across the table right to the edge until it nearly tipped off. Number. The word was simple, but it hit the room like a concussive blast. Roman's eyes narrowed. You don't understand the alternative. I understand perfectly, Maeve said, her voice rising, finding its strength. She stepped away from the table, facing him fully. You think you can walk in here, wave my dead father's sins in my face, and buy me? You think a shiny rock covers up the fact that you're a thug in a nice suit? Watch your mouth, Declan snarled from the back, taking a step forward. Maeve ignored him entirely, keeping her eyes locked on Roman. You don't want a partner, Roman. You want a pet. You want a guard dog you can dress up in silk and parade around your Mafia buddies to prove you're a civilized man. But you're not. You're hollow. You don't know how to earn a single real thing in this world, so you try to hold hostages and call it marriage. She picked up her heavy welding gloves. I'd rather freeze to death in this shop. I'd rather you shoot me right here, on this floor, than spend the rest of my life pretending I belong to a man who uses a ledger to buy human affection. So keep the ring. Keep the debt. Burn the place down if you want. But my answer is no. She tossed the gloves onto the table. Now get out of my shop. The air in the salvage yard turned to glass. It was so fragile, so brittle, that one sharp breath would shatter it. Garrett's hand was no longer hovering near his jacket. It was inside it, fingers wrapped around the grip of his pistol. Declan and Boyd had shifted their stances, their faces hardened into masks of professional violence. They had watched men get beaten half to death for a fraction of the disrespect this mechanic had just shown their boss. They waited for the nod. Just one slight tilt of Roman's chin, and Maeve would cease to be a problem. Maeve stood her ground. Her heart was hammering violently against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in her chest, but she refused to let it show on her face. If she was going to die over a pile of rusted metal and a gambling debt she didn't incur, she was going to do it with her chin up. Roman stared at her. His face was entirely blank. The calculating appraiser was gone, replaced by something dark, intense, and wholly unreadable. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The only sound was the distant rumble of the L train rattling over the tracks blocks away. Slowly, Roman broke eye contact. He looked down at the velvet box sitting precariously on the edge of the table. He reached out, picked it up, and slid it back into his pocket. Right, Roman said softly. Garrett took a half-step forward, his gun half drawn. Boss, give the word. Roman didn't look at Garrett. He didn't even raise his voice. Put it away, Garrett. Garrett froze. Boss, I said, put it away. The icy venom in Roman's voice made the burly enforcer flinch. Slowly, reluctantly, Garrett slipped the weapon back into its holster. Maeve braced herself. The psychological games were worse than the physical threats. She waited for him to issue a deadline. You have 24 hours to vacate. Or, we'll see how brave you are when the sun goes down. Instead, Roman reached up and grabbed the lapels of his $4,000 bespoke overcoat. He shrugged it off his shoulders. He didn't hand it to his men. He folded it neatly and laid it over the back of an old, dusty church pew. Then he reached for his silk tie. He loosened it, pulled it over his head, and tossed it onto the coat. Maeve frowned, her survival instincts misfiring in confusion. "What are you doing?" Roman didn't answer. He unbuttoned the cuffs of his crisp white dress shirt and began rolling the sleeves up past his forearms. His arms were corded with muscle, marred by a jagged, faded scar running up his left forearm, a stark reminder that he hadn't always been the man in the suit. He walked past Maeve, moving deeper into the shop. He stopped in front of the massive 600-pound cast-iron radiator she had been trying to winch onto a pallet for the past 2 hours. The chain hoist was jammed. It was a miserable, back-breaking job that she had abandoned out of sheer exhaustion. Roman looked at the jammed chain, then looked back at Maeve. "You're right," Roman said. His voice lacked the commanding edge it had 5 minutes ago. It sounded surprisingly tired, deeply human. "I don't know how to earn anything real. I've spent the last 10 years taking. I forgot what it looks like to build." He grabbed the heavy rusted iron chain with his bare hands. The grease and grime instantly stained his pale skin and ruined his cuffs. He gripped it tight, braced his boots against the concrete floor, and threw his weight backward. The muscles in his back bunched beneath the white shirt. With a harsh, grinding screech, the rusted gear of the hoist popped free. The radiator swung upward, clearing the floor. Roman secured the catch, breathing heavily, sweat immediately prickling his brow. Garrett, Declan, and Boyd stood paralyzed near the entrance. Their mouths were literally parted in shock. The head of the Caldwell Syndicate, a man who ordered assassinations over morning espresso, was hauling scrap metal. Roman turned back to Maeve. His hands were black with grease. He didn't look angry. He looked humbled. 400,000 is a lot of money to work off, Roman said, wiping a smear of grease from his hand onto his expensive trousers. "I figure we're going to need to move a lot of iron." Maeve stared at him, utterly speechless. Her cynicism, her defenses, her absolute certainty of how this encounter would end, all of it collapsed into profound confusion. "You can't just—" She started trailing off as she looked from the swinging radiator to his ruined shirt. "I'm not buying you," Maeve Roman said quietly, holding her gaze. "But I'm not leaving either. Show me what to do next." For the first 20 minutes, Maeve was convinced it was a psychological tactic. A bizarre, twisted power play designed to make her feel ridiculous before the inevitable bullet to the back of the head. Roman Caldwell didn't say another word. He just stood by the pallet, waiting for instruction. His 3 enforcers remained rooted near the door, a tableau of expensive wool and barely contained violence looking completely out of their depth. Maeve grabbed a heavy canvas tarp off a stack of salvaged copper pipes. She threw it on the concrete floor. "Put the radiator on that. We drag it to the freight elevator." "Unless your boys want to carry it?" Roman glanced at his men. Garrett was staring at the grease stains currently ruining Roman's custom-tailored slacks, Garrett Roman said. The name was spoken quietly, but it carried the weight of a physical blow. "Take Boyd and Declan. Wait outside. In the cars." Garrett blinked, his jaw working as he processed the order. "Boss, it's 19 degrees out there. And this area is outside," Roman repeated. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Garrett swallowed whatever protest he had left. He gave Maeve a look that promised a very slow, very painful death if a single hair on his boss's head was harmed, and then jerked his chin at the other 2. The 3 men filed out the rolling metal door, clattering shut behind them, plunging the warehouse back into a shadowy, icy silence. "Just you and me," Roman said, turning back to the heavy iron radiator. "Show me how this works." Maeve didn't go easy on him. She pointed to a pry bar. She showed him where to wedge it under the iron legs. She watched, arms crossed, expecting him to give up after the first slip. The iron was freezing. The edges were jagged, and the sheer, dead weight of the thing was meant for a forklift, not human hands. Roman jammed the pry bar under the base. He leaned his weight onto the steel lever. The muscles in his forearms corded the pale scar tissue, stretching tight. The radiator groaned, scraping across the concrete. "Push the tarp under," he grunted, breath pluming in the frigid air. Maeve kicked the heavy canvas under the lifted iron. Roman released the tension, and the radiator settled onto the fabric. He didn't ask for a break. He just walked around to the front of the tarp, grabbed the thick brass grommets, and started pulling. It was grueling work. The tarp slid grudgingly over the uneven concrete, snagging on bolts and divots. Roman dragged it 10 feet, then 20. Sweat began to soak through the back of his white shirt, turning the fine cotton translucent against his skin. Dirt and rust smeared across his knuckles. Every time the tarp snagged, he adjusted his grip and pulled harder. Maeve walked behind him, watching his broad shoulders heave with the effort. She felt a strange, uncomfortable knot tightening in her stomach. Men like Roman Caldwell didn't do this. They paid people to do this, or they killed people to avoid doing this. They reached the freight elevator at the back of the shop. Roman dropped the tarp, bending over with his hands on his knees, chest heaving. His hands were raw, the skin scraped and bleeding from the coarse canvas. Maeve walked past him and hit the button for the lift. The ancient gears ground together, pulling the grated cage down from the second floor. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, keeping her eyes on the descending cage. Roman straightened up. He wiped a hand across his forehead, leaving a broad streak of black grease across his brow. He looked less like a crime boss and more like a mechanic at the end of a double shift. "You said I didn't know how to earn a real thing," Roman said, his breathing finally slowing. "You said I try to hold hostages and call it marriage." I didn't like how that sounded, mostly because it was true. "So you're playing blue-collar dress-up to prove a point," Maeve scoffed, hitting the emergency stop as the lift settled, flush with the floor. "You think an hour of manual labor buys you a conscience?" "I don't have a conscience, Maeve. I lost that when I was 14, stealing hubcaps in the South Side just to buy dinner." Roman stepped up to her, invading her space, but this time there was no threat in his posture, just a stark, naked honesty. "I'm not trying to buy a conscience. I'm trying to figure out why a woman with $300,000 of debt freezing in a warehouse looked a loaded gun in the face and said no. In my world, everyone has a price. Everyone caves. You didn't." He turned back to the radiator, grabbing the tarp again. "I need a wife who doesn't cave," he said, quietly, pulling the heavy iron into the elevator cage. "I'm just trying to figure out what your price actually is. Because it clearly isn't money." Maeve stared at his back as he wrestled the iron into place. For the first time since he walked into her shop 3 weeks ago, she realized she had no idea who she was dealing with. He wasn't just a thug. He was a machine learning a new set of rules, and that was infinitely more dangerous. By 7 o'clock, the temperature inside the warehouse had dropped below freezing. The cold no longer bit at the skin. It settled deep into the marrow. Maeve finally cooled it. She killed the main power breaker to the heavy machinery, plunging the rear of the shop into darkness, leaving only the weak, yellowish glow of the halogen work lights near her office. Roman was sitting on a stack of reclaimed oak floorboards. His custom overcoat was still draped over the church pew. His white shirt was ruined beyond salvation, torn at the shoulder, soaked in sweat, and covered in black rust. He was staring at his hands. His knuckles were bruised, the skin broken in 3 places. Maeve walked into her small glass-walled office and returned a minute later with a battered first aid kit and a thermos. She dropped the kit on the workbench next to him and unscrewed the thermos lid. "It's black. It's bitter." "It's hot," she said, pouring a cup of coffee into the plastic lid and holding it out. Roman looked at the cup, then up at her. He took it cautiously, his fingers brushing hers. His skin was freezing. He took a sip. He didn't flinch at the taste, just closed his eyes as the heat hit his stomach. "Thank you." Maeve popped the latch on the first aid kit and tossed him a bottle of rubbing alcohol and a roll of gauze. "Clean your hands. Infection in this place happens fast. I'm not explaining to Garrett why his boss died of tetanus in my shop." Roman set the coffee down and uncapped the alcohol. He poured it directly over his raw knuckles. He didn't hiss. He didn't even blink. He just let the harsh liquid strip the grease and blood away. Maeve leaned against the workbench, watching him. The silence between them felt different now. Less like a standoff, more like a ceasefire. "My father was a coward," Maeve said suddenly. Roman paused, the gauze half unrolled in his hand. He didn't interrupt. "He started betting on horses when my mum got sick." She continued staring at the concrete floor. "Said he was trying to pay for the treatments, but she died. And he kept betting. Horses, dogs, cards. He bled this business dry. Every piece of inventory we sold, the money went straight into his pocket and then straight to your people. When he died, I thought the worst was over. I didn't know he had leveraged the building." She looked up at Roman, her eyes hard and bright in the dim light. "You talk about your world like it's a business, like it's just transactions and ledgers. But your ledger is written in human misery. You prey on weakness. You prey on addicts." Roman finished wrapping his hand, tucking the end of the gauze in neatly. He picked up his coffee and took another slow sip. "You think I don't know that Roman's voice was devoid of defense. It was just flat. My father owed men just like me. He couldn't pay. So they took it out in flesh. I watched them break his legs in our living room. I was 12. You want to know how I survived? I went to the men who broke him, and I asked for a job. I carried their bags. I hid their guns. I learned their ledgers." He stood up, pacing slowly in the small circle of halogen light. "I didn't build this empire because I enjoy the cruelty, Maeve. I built it because I refuse to be the man on the floor getting his legs broken. Ever again." He stopped and looked at her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "I am a monster. I know exactly what I am. But I am a controlled monster. I keep the worst things in this city at bay. You think my syndicate is bad? The people who would fill the vacuum if I fall are animals. They don't offer prenuptial agreements. They just take." He gestured to the sprawling, dark warehouse. "Your father made his choices. I didn't force him to the table. But you're the one left holding the bag. I offered you a way out because I need someone who isn't intimidated by the shadows I walk in. I need someone who can look at the blood on the floor and hand me a mop, not a police badge." Maeve felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He was completely unashamed. He wasn't asking for absolution. He was offering a partnership built on brutal realism. "I'm not a criminal, Roman," she said quietly. "I fix broken things. I put stained glass back together. I salvage what people throw away. I can't be the face of your syndicate." "You already are," Roman said softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. Maeve unfolded it. It was a bank receipt, a wire transfer, $300,000, paid in full. The receiving account belonged to the holding company that owned the mortgage on her warehouse. "I didn't buy the debt today," Roman said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "I paid it off. The marker is gone. This building is yours. Free and clear. You owe me nothing." Maeve stared at the numbers. The paper shook in her hands. The crushing weight that had sat on her chest for 2 years evaporated in a single heartbeat, leaving her breathless and dizzy. "Why," she whispered, looking up at him in shock. "If I owe you nothing, why did you bring the ring? Why did you make the threat?" "Because if I came in here and played the savior, you would have thrown me out." Roman replied, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You only respect a fight, Maeve. I had to give you one." He picked up his ruined coat and tossed it over his shoulder. "I'll be back tomorrow. We still have a lot of iron to move." 2 days later, the rhythm had fundamentally changed. Roman Caldwell didn't show up in a bespoke suit. He arrived in heavy denim steel-toed boots and a thick canvas jacket. He left his enforcers at the gate. He didn't talk much. He just worked. He took orders, he lifted where she told him to lift, and he slowly learned how to operate the plasma cutter without blinding himself. Maeve found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. There was a quiet intensity to his labor. He wasn't doing it to impress her anymore. He was doing it because the physical exhaustion seemed to quiet whatever demons lived in his head. It was Thursday afternoon. The sky outside was the color of bruised iron, promising freezing rain. Maeve was underneath a massive 1920s bank vault door, grinding away decades of rust, while Roman was cataloging brass fixtures on the opposite side of the shop. The sound of the angle grinder masked the noise of the intrusion. Maeve didn't know anything was wrong until the grinder suddenly died in her hands. The power cord had been violently yanked from the wall socket. She slid out from under the vault door, pushing her safety goggles up. 3 men were standing in the center aisle of the salvage yard. They weren't Roman's men. They wore cheap leather-scuffed boots and carried the restless, twitchy energy of street-level enforcers looking to make a name. The one in the middle, a wiry man with a bad tribal tattoo snaking up his neck, had his boot planted on Maeve's power cord. "Shop's closed," the tattooed man sneered, kicking over a bucket of bolts. They clattered loudly across the concrete. "We're looking for Caldwell. Word on the street is he's playing house in a junkyard." Thought it was a joke. Maeve stood up slowly, her hand instinctively drifting toward the heavy steel wrench on her workbench. She knew exactly who these men were. They were the bottom feeders Roman had talked about, the vacuum fillers. If word had leaked that the head of the Caldwell syndicate was spending his afternoons unguarded in a civilian warehouse, he was a sitting duck. "You're lost," Maeve said, her voice steady, masking the sudden spike of adrenaline. "No Caldwell here. Get out of my shop before I call the police." The men laughed. The sound was harsh and ugly. The man on the left pulled a crowbar from inside his jacket. "Police don't come down here fast enough, sweetheart." "Now where is he?" "He's right behind you." The voice was low, smooth, and utterly devoid of the exhaustion Maeve had seen over the last 2 days. It was the voice of a predator that had just found its prey in a closed trap. The 3 men spun around. Roman stepped out from the shadows of the brass fixtures. He held a 2-foot length of solid steel pipe in his right hand. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly bored. "O'Shea's boys," Roman observed, tilting his head. "I told Jimmy to keep his trash on the west side. Seems he's having trouble controlling his dogs." The tattooed man pulled a switchblade, the blade snapping out with a sharp click. "Jimmy sends his regards, Caldwell. You're slipping, coming here alone. Without Garrett. You got soft." Roman didn't say a word. He didn't posture. He just moved. It wasn't a movie fight. It wasn't choreographed or elegant. It was shocking, brutal, and horrifyingly fast. Roman closed the distance in 2 strides. The tattooed man lunged with the knife. Roman didn't dodge. He deflected the man's arm with his left forearm, ignoring the blade, slicing a shallow cut into his sleeve, and brought the steel pipe down on the man's knee. The sound of the joint shattering echoed like a gunshot. The man screamed, collapsing. Before the other 2 could process what had happened, Roman pivoted. He drove the blunt end of the pipe directly into the sternum of the man with the crowbar. All the air rushed out of the man's lungs in a sickening wheeze, and he folded in half, dropping to the floor, gagging for breath. The 3rd man, the youngest, his eyes wide with sudden terror, took a step back, raising his hands. Wait, man." Roman dropped the pipe. It clanged loudly against the concrete. He grabbed the kid by the throat, slammed him against a massive oak door, propped against the wall, and pinned him there. The kid's feet dangled 2 inches off the ground. Roman leaned in close. His voice was a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the warehouse, Maeve heard every word. "You go back to Jimmy Roman," hissed, his eyes dead and cold. "You tell him I am exactly where I want to be. And if he ever sends his garbage into this woman's shop again, I won't just kill him. I will burn his operation to the ground while he watches." "Do you understand?" The kid choked out a frantic, gasping nod. Roman dropped him. The kid hit the floor, scrambled to his feet, grabbed the wheezing man by the collar, and dragged him toward the door. The tattooed man was writhing on the ground, clutching his shattered knee, sobbing. "Take him with you," Roman commanded, not looking at them. It took them 2 miserable minutes to drag their wounded out of the warehouse. The metal door rattled shut, and the sound of tires screeching out of the gravel driveway faded into the distance. Roman stood in the center of the aisle. The lethal energy slowly drained out of him. He looked down at his left arm. Blood was seeping through his canvas jacket where the blade had caught him. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, his back to Maeve. "This is what I am," Roman said, his voice raw. He didn't sound proud. He sounded resigned. "This is the disease I bring with me. I try to clean the grease off my hands, but the blood stays." Maeve stared at his back. 10 minutes ago, she had watched him carefully polish a piece of antique brass. Just now, she had watched him break a man in half without a second thought. She should be terrified. She should be screaming at him to leave and never come back. Instead, Maeve walked over to her workbench. She picked up the first aid kit. She walked up behind him. "Take the jacket off," she said, her voice perfectly calm. Roman turned around, his eyes wide with surprise. He expected her to be holding the wrench. He expected fear, disgust, rejection. She held up the roll of gauze. "You're bleeding on my floor, Roman. Take the jacket off. Let's get you patched up." For the first time in his life, the head of the Caldwell Syndicate had absolutely nothing to say. He just took off his jacket. The canvas jacket hit the concrete with a heavy, muted thud. Roman stood under the harsh glare of the halogen worklight, his white t-shirt clinging to his chest. The left sleeve was soaked through the fabric, clinging awkwardly to the laceration on his forearm. Maeve pointed to the heavy wooden stool near her workbench. "Sit." Roman didn't argue. He walked over and sat down, his posture rigid. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the cold reality of the warehouse and the sharp sting of the blade's path. Maeve grabbed a pair of heavy fabric shears from her tool belt. She stepped between his knees, entirely focused on the wound. She slid the cold metal of the scissors under the bloody hem of his sleeve and cut upward, slicing the cotton away to expose the injury. It was an ugly, jagged line, maybe 4 inches long. It wasn't hitting an artery, but it was deep enough that the edges of the skin sat stubbornly apart. "It needs stitches," Maeve said, her voice clinical. She turned to the sink behind her, running the water until it was freezing cold, and grabbed a clean rag. "I have a doctor on payroll." Roman muttered, his eyes tracking her movements. "Garrett can take me. Garrett is sitting in an SUV half a mile away, obeying the order you gave him to stay out," Maeve replied, turning off the tap. She walked back and pressed the cold, wet rag firmly against the cut. Roman hissed slightly, his jaw clenching. "And by the time he gets here, drives you across the city to your discreet doctor, you'll bleed over my floor and my truck," she continued. She kept the pressure applied with one hand and reached for her first aid kit with the other. She pulled out a small sealed packet of sutures and a bottle of iodine. "I sew leather upholstery and canvas tarps for a living. Skin isn't much different, just bleeds more." Roman looked up at her. Her face was inches from his. There was a smear of grease on her cheek. Her eyes were completely steady. "You shouldn't be doing this," Roman said quietly. "I'm applying pressure. It's basic first aid. I'm not talking about the arm, Maeve." Roman reached up with his uninjured hand and gently wrapped his fingers around her wrist, stopping her from pouring the iodine. His touch was warm, contrasting sharply with the freezing air of the shop. I just brought a knife fight into your home. I shattered a man's leg 10 feet from where you sleep. You should be running for the door. You should be terrified. Maeve looked down at his hand, then up into his dark, searching eyes. My father used to sit in that office, Maeve said, nodding toward the glass enclosure without breaking eye contact. He would get off the phone with his bookie, pour a glass of cheap scotch, and cry. He cried because he knew he was losing everything, but he didn't have the spine to stop. He let the debt pile up until it crushed this family. That's what terrifies me, Roman. Cowardice. Weakness disguised as bad luck. She gently pulled her wrist from his grip, picked up the iodine, and uncapped it. This is going to burn, she warned, and poured the dark amber liquid over the open wound. Roman didn't flinch this time. He just watched her. You defended my shop, Maeve said, her voice softening just a fraction as she tore open the suture packet. She pulled out the curved needle with a pair of needle-nose pliers she usually used for delicate wire work. You didn't ask for permission. You didn't hesitate. You stepped between me and a threat, and you ended it. It was violent. It was ugly. But it was honest. She took a breath, anchoring her hands, and drove the needle through the tough skin of his forearm. Roman's muscles twitched involuntarily, but he remained perfectly silent. I don't like your world, Roman, she murmured, tying off the first knot and snipping the thread. But I understand it. You protect what is yours. You handle the things that need handling. She moved an inch down the cut, driving the needle through again. Blood welled up, coating her fingers. She wiped it away with a piece of gauze and pulled the thread tight. Is that what I am doing? Roman asked. His voice was a low rumble in his chest. Protecting what is mine. Maeve paused. The needle hovered above his skin. She looked up. The physical distance between them was entirely gone. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the metallic tang of blood, and the sharp chemical bite of the iodine. I'm not a piece of salvage, Roman, she said firmly. You paid the debt. I don't belong to you. I know, Roman replied. He leaned forward slightly. The movement was slow, giving her every opportunity to step back. She didn't. If you belonged to me, I wouldn't be sitting on this stool, letting you punch holes in my arm with pliers. I would be dictating terms. But I'm not. I am sitting here, bleeding, answering your questions. He looked down at the half-finished stitches, then back to her face. I don't want to own you, Maeve. I want you to choose me. And that is a terrifying concept for a man who has spent his entire life forcing compliance. Maeve stared at him. The sheer vulnerability in his confession was more disarming than any weapon he could have carried. She swallowed hard, the tight knot in her chest, expanding into something dangerously close to affection. She looked back down at his arm. Keep still. 3 more stitches, or this is going to scar ugly. I already have plenty of scars, Roman said, leaning back, allowing her to finish the work. Not on my watch, Maeve murmured. 10 minutes later, the cut was closed. It wasn't the neatest medical work, but the bleeding had stopped, and the wound was securely bandaged beneath a tight wrap of white gauze. Maeve stepped back, tossing the bloody rags into a metal bin and dropping her pliers into the sink to be sterilized later. She turned around to find Roman standing. He was looking at his phone. The screen cast a pale, cold light across his face. The vulnerability from a moment ago was gone, replaced by the hardened, calculated mask of the syndicate boss. What is it? Maeve asked, crossing her arms to ward off the sudden chill in the room. Roman slipped the phone into his pocket. Jimmy O'Shea is going to retaliate. The men I sent back to him. They were a message. Jimmy is too proud to let it go unanswered. So what happens now? Roman picked up his blood-stained canvas jacket. He didn't put it on. He just held it in his uninjured hand. Now I go back to work, Roman said. He looked at her, his expression grim. Lock the doors, Maeve. Don't answer for anyone you don't know. I'll leave Garrett at the end of your street. Roman Maeve started taking a step toward him. No, he cut her off, his voice, carrying that sharp, commanding edge again. I stepped into your world for 3 days. Now I have to go handle mine. If I stay here, I bring the war to your doorstep. He turned and walked toward the rolling metal door. He hit the button, and the heavy aluminum began to grind upward, letting the bitter night air rush into the shop. He didn't look back as he walked out into the darkness. The warehouse felt entirely too large. For the next 4 days, Maeve lived in a state of suspended animation. She tried to work. She dragged the acetylene torch out and began cutting down a pile of rusted I-beams, letting the shower of sparks and the roar of the flame drown out the silence. But every time a car drove past on the street outside, her hand tightened on the torch. Garrett was a phantom presence. She never saw him, but she knew he was there. Twice she found a paper cup of decent coffee sitting on the ledge of her frosted glass window in the morning. Once she saw the faint glow of a cigarette ember down the alley at 2 in the morning. Roman was gone. The news didn't carry stories about mob wars. The violence of Roman's world was subterranean. It happened in the basements of illegal card rooms on the docks at midnight, in the back rooms of shell corporations. But Maeve could feel the tremors. On the evening of the 4th day, the rolling door shuddered. Maeve dropped her wrench. She stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. The door didn't open. Someone was knocking on the thick aluminum. 3 heavy measured strikes. She walked slowly to the small pedestrian door set into the side of the building. She peered through the reinforced glass peephole. It was Garrett. Maeve unlocked the deadbolts and pulled the heavy steel door open. Garrett stood on the threshold. He looked exhausted. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was gone, and there was a dark purple bruise blossoming across his left cheekbone. "He's alive," Garrett said, immediately, seeing the tight, panicked look on her face. Maeve let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She leaned against the doorframe, closing her eyes for a brief second. "Come inside." Garrett stepped into the shop, rubbing his gloved hands together. "Can't stay. Just came to give you an update. The boss didn't want you worrying." "I'm not worrying," Maeve lied effortlessly. "I'm annoyed. It's hard to run a business with an armed guard smoking in my alley." Garrett gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "Yeah, well, the guard duty is over. The issue with O'Shea has been resolved." Maeve looked at him sharply. "Resolved? You mean Roman killed him?" Garrett shook his head. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a silver flask, taking a short pull before answering. "No. That's the crazy part. Usually a guy sends muscle at the boss puts that guy in the ground. It's the rule. It keeps order." He capped the flask, staring out into the dimly lit warehouse. But he didn't do that. He hit O'Shea's supply lines. He bought off O'Shea's alderman. He choked the cash flow. It took 4 days of 0 sleep and pulling every marker the Caldwell family had in this city, but he bankrupted the bastard. O'Shea packed up his crew and moved to Cleveland this morning, alive but broken. Maeve frowned, processing the information. Why would he do it that way? It sounds like it cost him more time and money than a bullet. Garrett looked at her, his expression suddenly very serious. "You don't get it, do you? He didn't want the bodies. He told us, no collateral. We don't bleed on civilian floors anymore. He fought a corporate war against a street thug because he's trying to change the way the ledger works." Garrett turned to leave, grabbing the handle of the steel door. He paused, looking back at Maeve over his shoulder. "I've worked for Roman for 8 years. I watched him build this thing from the dirt. He is ruthless and he is cold. But he's never been reckless." Garrett's eyes narrowed slightly. "He's changing the rules, Maeve. And in our world, When you change the rules, people look for the reason. You're the reason. Don't make him regret it. The heavy steel door clicked shut, leaving Maeve alone in the freezing shop. She walked back to her workbench and stared at the heavy iron radiator sitting in the corner, the one Roman had hauled with his bare hands. The grease stains were still on the tarp. "I am a controlled monster," he had said. "I keep the worst things in this city at bay." He hadn't lied. He had gone out and neutralized a threat without descending into the mindless slaughter that usually characterized his syndicate. He had chosen the harder, cleaner path. Because he was thinking about her. He was thinking about the disgust in her eyes when she looked at the ledger of human misery. Maeve grabbed her heavy coat off the back of the office chair. She didn't want to wait anymore. She was tired of the cold, tired of the rust, and utterly tired of pretending she didn't care whether Roman Caldwell walked back through her door. She turned off the halogen lights, plunging the warehouse into total darkness. She locked the pedestrian door behind her and walked out into the freezing Chicago wind. The Caldwell Syndicate operated out of a high-rise in the financial district. It was a glass and steel monolith that housed investment firms, corporate lawyers, and on the top 3 floors, the nerve center of Roman's empire. Maeve parked her battered pickup truck between 2 sleek black sedans in the underground garage. She was wearing her heavy canvas work coat, steel-toed boots, and a pair of faded denim jeans. She looked entirely out of place in the polished marble lobby, but she walked with a purpose that made the security guards hesitate. She stepped into the elevator and hit the button for the 42nd floor. The doors chimed open, revealing a sprawling minimalist reception area. The receptionist, a sharply dressed woman in her 30s, looked up, her professional smile faltering as she took in Maeve's grease-stained boots. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked cautiously. "I need to see Roman," Maeve said, walking straight past the desk toward the heavy oak double doors at the end of the hallway. "Excuse me, you can't go back there. Mr. Caldwell is in a meeting." Maeve ignored her. She reached the oak doors, grabbed the brass handles, and pushed them open. The boardroom was massive. A long mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by a dozen men in expensive suits. The air was thick with the smell of espresso and tension. At the head of the table sat Roman. He looked exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of 4 days without sleep. He was back in his bespoke suit, the tie pulled loose, a tumbler of amber liquid sitting untouched in front of him. The room went dead silent as Maeve walked in. 12 pairs of hardened, dangerous eyes snapped toward her. Boyd, standing near the window, instinctively reached into his jacket. Roman raised a single hand. The movement was slight, but it froze every man in the room. He stared at Maeve. The exhaustion in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sharp, burning intensity. He didn't ask how she got past security. He didn't ask why she was interrupting a high-level sit-down. He stood up. "Gentlemen," Roman said, his voice quiet, but echoing off the glass walls. "We are finished for the day. Clear the room." One of the older men, a silver-haired copper with a thick neck, frowned. "Roman, we haven't finalized the shipping routes for the new." I said clear the room. Carmine Roman repeated his tone, dropping an octave, carrying the unmistakable threat of violence. Carmine swallowed hard, closed his leather binder, and stood up. Within 30 seconds, the boardroom was empty. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving Maeve and Roman alone. Roman remained at the head of the table. He didn't rush toward her. He just watched her, his chest rising and falling slowly. "You shouldn't be here," Roman said finally. "And you shouldn't have left without saying goodbye." Maeve shot back, walking slowly down the length of the mahogany table. She ran her hand along the polished wood, feeling the unnatural smoothness of it. It lacked the character of the salvaged oak in her shop. "Garrett came to see me. Garrett talks too much. Garrett told me you bankrupt a man instead of shooting him." Maeve stopped a few feet away from him. "He said you spent 4 days calling in every favor you had to keep the blood off the floor. Roman looked away, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering skyline of the city. It was a strategic decision. It sends a different kind of message. It shows the other families that I control the infrastructure, not just the muscle. Bullshit, Maeve said flatly. Roman snapped his gaze back to her. You did it because you knew if you killed him, I would never look at you the same way, Maeve said. She stepped closer, invading his space, just as he had done to her in the warehouse. You did it because you're trying to prove that you can build something, not just break it. Roman's jaw tightened. He looked down at her, the mask of the stoic Mafia boss, cracking, revealing the deeply tired man underneath. I told you I am a monster, Maeve, he whispered, his voice rough. I can change the methods, but I can't change the nature of this life. There will always be threats. There will always be men like O'Shea. If you stand next to me, you stand in the crosshairs. I'm already in the crosshairs, Roman Maeve replied, refusing to back down. I run a salvage yard in a city that eats the weak. I deal with thieves, crooked inspectors, and bankers who steal more than the thugs do. I know how to fight. Roman reached out his fingers, lightly tracing the heavy canvas of her coat. You're asking to step into a cage. No, Maeve said, her voice steady and absolute. I rejected the cage you offered me in my shop. I rejected the debt, the marker, the transaction. I am not a hostage. She reached up and grabbed the lapels of his expensive suit. She pulled him slightly downward, forcing him to meet her gaze on her terms. I'm proposing a partnership, Maeve said. You handle the shadows. I'll handle the rust. You don't hide things from me, and you don't treat me like glass. I am not your pet, and I am not your alibi. I am your equal. Roman stared at her. The sheer audacity, the absolute fearlessness in her eyes left him completely speechless for the second time in his life. He had spent years surrounded by men who bowed to him out of fear and women who flocked to him for his wealth. He had never met someone who looked at his empire, looked at the blood on his hands, and demanded a seat at the table on her own merit. Slowly, a genuine smile broke across Roman's face. It changed him entirely. It erased the cruelty from his jawline and lit up the dark, dead spaces in his eyes. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out the black velvet box. He didn't open it this time. He just placed it on the mahogany table between them. No debt, Roman said, quietly, his voice vibrating with a deep, newfound reverence. No markers. No transactions. He stepped closer, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her against him. He smelled of expensive Scotch cold city air, and the faint, lingering scent of the iodine she had poured on his arm. Just a choice, Roman whispered. Maeve looked at the velvet box. She didn't need to open it to know what it represented now. It wasn't a chain. It was an anchor. She looked back up at Roman, a cynical smirk playing on her lips. I hope you don't think you're getting out of moving the rest of those radiators, she said. Roman let out a rough, genuine laugh. He ducked his head, pressing his forehead against hers. I'll move every piece of iron in that shop, Maeve, he murmured. As long as I get to come home to it. Maeve reached behind his neck, pulling him down the rest of the way, and kissed him. It wasn't soft, and it wasn't delicate. It was desperate bruising, and fiercely alive, the collision of two people who had spent their lives surviving, finally realizing they had found someone to build a life with. In the quiet of the boardroom, high above the chaotic streets of the city, the ledger was finally balanced. Thank you so much for watching. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. What was your favorite moment between Maeve and Roman? Did he earn his redemption? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading your theories. Make sure to share this video with anyone who loves a deeply grounded, gritty romance. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. See you in the next one.